welcome to the SVG-TV news for Monday, August 8th. I am Khalil Kato with the details. The woman accused and charged for wounding Prime Minister Dr. Ralph Gonsalves during last Thursday's protest in capital Kingstown appeared at the magistrate's court today. The woman proclaimed her innocence and pleaded not guilty to the charge inside the courtroom and outside as she spoke briefly with members of the media. Larissa Pugsley-Kidd tells us more.
Annabelle Lewis, the woman accused and charged for wounding Prime Minister Dr. Ralph Gonsalves, was granted bail in the sum of 3,000 EC dollars with one surety after pleading not guilty to the charge. Lewis, a 56-year-old vendor of Layu, arrived at the Kingstown Magistrate Court this morning to a heavy police presence outside the court building. As she was being taken inside, family members could not control their emotions.
My mother will not be made a scapegoat. My mother will not be made a scapegoat. My mother is innocent.
I'm not going to tolerate this behavior from you. You are in the presence of the court. Okay? And I am Superintendent Francis speaking to you.
My mother is innocent.
You hear me? I am Superintendent Francis speaking to you. You are in the presence of the court. And we will not tolerate this kind of behavior. Otherwise, you'll be arrested for breach of the Public Order Act.
Lewis is being represented by lawyer K. Bacchus Batiste and Israel Bruce, while the state is being represented by Director of Public Prosecutions, Sajila McDowell. The charges read that on August 5, 2021, Lewis maliciously wounded Ralph Gonsalves of Old Montrose. Lawyer representing the accused, K. Bacchus Batiste, asked for bail, which was not objected to by the DPP. Bacchus Batiste also asked for full disclosure, which has been set for August 30th. Following the hearing, Bacchus Batiste told reporters on the side that she would like for the case to go to trial at the earliest possible time.
I told the court that I'm very anxious for this matter to be heard. We are ready with our defense. Even though I haven't seen all the disclosure yet, we're going to be ready. So I don't want it to languish. I don't want this lady to suffer. This lady is innocent. This lady was forced to give a statement that is not true. And so I don't want this matter to linger. We are going to try and get a trial as soon as we get disclosure. I want a trial as soon as possible. I even see this as an abuse against women.
The woman at the center of the case, Annabelle Lewis, had reportedly given a statement to the police when she was taken into custody on August 5, 2021. Her lawyer is, however, challenging the statement, noting that her client was pressured to do so without legal representation.
There are legal ways to deal with it. Statements are only admissible in evidence if they were given voluntarily. In this case, she gave it without a lawyer being present. She was forced to do it. It is not even true. So I don't know where they're going to go with that.
Lewis came out the magistrate court proclaiming her innocence.
I'm innocent of this. I am so innocent. I did not fire no stone after the Prime Minister.
While there were no protesters on the outside as was anticipated, there were, however, some onlookers a distance away from the magistrate court who cheered Lewis as she was being transported home.
Meanwhile, the Prime Minister is reportedly suffering from post-concussion syndrome as a result of the injury sustained during last Thursday's protest. PM Gonsalves phoned into WeFM's Issues at Hand program yesterday from Barbados, where an MRI was done, and said that he has not been the same after receiving the blow to the head, especially his vision, which has become blurred.
The neurologist, Dr. Gill, and the technician did some further tests on me, and another scan of the brain. Well, yesterday morning, when I got up, and as always, I began to read, and the pages were blurred. I was reading, but with great difficulty. It's been the words with clarity on the page.
The Prime Minister said that his doctor told him, based on the symptoms, it is in keeping with post-concussion syndrome. However, tests were done which showed that his vision will be okay.
Which have different manifestations, one of which is blurry vision, unsteady walk, not as strong concentration as before, and even occasional loss of particular words. Fortunately, he said that all these things, among others, are transient, are temporary, and over a 4-week period. And I just did the other scan, and there is nothing to look specifically to see if there is a problem with the optic nerve, those which you use for this purposes of sight now. And they're all intact, thankfully. So it's just part of this post-concussion syndrome.
Follow-up tests are expected, and the Prime Minister said that he will be monitored for the next 3 to 4 weeks and that he intends to follow the doctor's orders. The Prime Minister arrived back in state earlier this afternoon. At an emergency virtual conference on Saturday, August 7th, opposition leader Dr. Godwin Friday expressed concern with police raids, which he said were carried out at the homes of several supporters and other activists. Dr. Friday said the action by the police was uncalled for, as he listed some of the persons' homes which were raided, including the General Secretary of the NDP, Tyrone James.
The first news we heard was of heavily armed Black Squad officers arriving at the home of Tyrone James, the General Secretary of the New Democratic Party. He was not there, but they would subsequently go back. Throughout the afternoon, there were raids on the homes of at least 10 persons that we are aware of. 10 persons. The New Democratic Party's host of the New Time program and the moderator of this press conference, Mr. Colin Graham, businessman Lance Oliver, Luzette King, Patches Knights, Mr. Joe Da Silva, Kenson King, Mr. Keisha Williams, and also Adriana King.
Dr. Friday also noted that the persons whose homes were raided were those who were on the front line of the protests on Thursday, August 5th, whom he said were exercising their democratic right.
This is clearly an attempt to intimidate and to frighten protesters, to frighten Vincentian citizens, nationals, who have taken to the street because they are in disagreement with the government, particularly regarding the bill that was passed in the House recently to amend the Public Health Act.
The host of the NDP's New Times radio program, Colin Graham, was one of the persons whose homes was raided and at Saturday's news conference, he spoke on what transpired.
About just after 4 o'clock this afternoon, heavily armed officers of the Black Squad arrived at my home with a warrant in hand to search for guns, ammunition, mobile devices, and documents. They searched my bedroom and they went through my personal belongings. After confiscating and seizing my cell phone, a laptop, 2 digital cameras, some smart cards, they proceeded to search my daughter's room, both my eldest daughter and my youngest daughter. They also proceeded to search through my son's bedroom. And then they wrapped up their search in my mother's bedroom.
Also at Saturday's news conference, the opposition leader again condemned all acts of violence, including the injury caused to Prime Minister Dr. Alf Gonsalves, and wished him a speedy recovery. Meanwhile, outside the magistrate's court, opposition senator and lawyer Israel Bruce says that he is aware of 12 persons whose homes were raided, and while he understands the police have their job to do, there is nothing they will find that will incriminate any of their members.
What I can say is that we have nothing to worry about. There's nothing to bother about. There was no discussion about committing no criminal offense. They'll find nothing on no phone, on no tablet, on no laptop, in no documents, nowhere. that suggests that there was some sort of a collective agreement and or understanding to do anything to anyone at the protest, including Dr. Gonzalez. So it is an exercise in futility, I would say. It's a waste of precious time. Like we seen here this morning, all these good officers could have been doing something better at that time. But of course, security is an issue, and the police have to do their job, and we'll let them do their jobs.
Meanwhile, on radio yesterday, Prime Minister Dr. Ralph Gonsalves said in the coming days he will reveal the person who he believes is responsible for the act of violence meted out against him during the protest action. He noted that while the individual did not launch the projectile which harmed him, the person is responsible.
Bob is going to stop me. I will make public when I return. I return tomorrow afternoon on 4:30. As to the individual whom I consider personally responsible for the criminal act against me, I'm not talking about the person who actually threw the projectile, the object, and caused the injury and the concussion. But when you throw a missile, a projectile of whatever type, at someone, you intend, and at their head, you intend to cause that person serious bodily harm, grievous bodily harm, or to kill them. One situation prior, one condition prior to the shedding of the blood of the Prime Minister, and a condition, a political condition, and a security condition after the shedding of the blood. That is self-evident, and no kind of sophistry by persons in the opposition, including the leader of the opposition, and also that fundamental fact.
The Prime Minister noted that never in the history of St. Vincent and the Grenadines has there been an occurrence where a parliamentarian has been kept from the House of Assembly.
For decades, protests of one kind or another in front of the precincts of Parliament, but on no occasion has anyone ever had his or her path to the Parliament obstructed, impeded, no one had been assaulted hitherto, and no act of battery committed, no wounding against any member of Parliament.
PM Gonsalves also used the time to thank members of Parliament on the government side who saw the bills through in his absence, noting that in doing so, they upheld an important principle that was potentially at stake.
I'm very pleased to see that the members of Parliament and the government side carried out my request to complete the entire order paper, all 5 bills, and to just do them all through the night. And I've been advised that by independent voices that their work was commendable, and I thank them. Because there was an important principle at stake, that no mob, no instigators of violence, no provocateurs, no backroom authors and manipulators of violence would be permitted to undermine the parliamentary process and to deter Parliament from doing its work.
The Prime Minister also thanked all well-wishers who would have reached out to him personally and those in his inner circle, that should be those in his circle, including his wife Eloise, permanent secretaries, and his security detail. In news of the La Soufrière volcano, the signals from the monitoring network of the volcano continue to indicate that it has ended its recent erupting phase. This from lead scientist monitoring the volcano, Professor Richard Robertson, on the Eyeing La Soufrière program on NBC Radio today.
Seismic activity at a low level, not very much earthquakes. We had a few earthquakes as usual in the weekend. We have, the numbers vary from about 5 or 10 over different periods of time, a day or two. But in terms of the numbers that we have in sort of at the stations that we've always been monitoring for the longest, the numbers are still quite low and sort of more indicative of this intervening period between eruptions that you had at Soufrière from time to time.
The lead scientist said that the main problem now facing the people are lahars or mudflows, noting that several were recorded across the red and orange zones on the weekend.
The only, I guess, most significant thing on the weekend is the fact that we had some rains yesterday, as most people know, and once you have rains, you have runny rivers, flooded rivers, and lahars, and that's what we had. Clearly, there were lahars, both from the signals that we have on the drums and also from my own observations because we were out in the field. There were lahars down Wallabu, Rabaca, and a couple of rivers north of that. I actually was at that river just before you get to Overland. I'm not sure if it's called it Turuma River. I'm not sure exactly the name, but it was flooded and there were people there stranded on both sides of the river trying to get across in vehicles. So that's the most significant thing in terms of the rain and the lahars.
The last gas measurement done on Friday shows that 300 tons of gas are being released each day. Professor Robertson further spoke on some of the hazards that he saw on the road yesterday as he encouraged persons not to cross where there is heavy water flow from rivers.
The most telling about that river just before you get to Overland, I think it's the Turuma River is called. There was quite a bit of water coming down. I mean, I approached the river and there was obviously traffic backed up. Rain was drizzling, so you kind of waited in the car, wondering what was happening. And after a while, you kind of had to walk out and see what was happening. So I went towards the river and I saw that what was happening essentially and why the traffic was piled up is because some cars were trying to get across and they kept getting stuck essentially as you would expect.
Right.
And then they had to get pulled out. So that cycle went on a couple of times. And it just makes the point that what you keep making, that when the rivers come down, I mean, people know that. Rubber used to come down all the time and people had to live with that. So you know that if the rubber cup coming down, stay on one side, don't try to pass, especially if you have a four-wheel drive vehicle. So I couldn't understand why people were trying to pass, but I guess the person who's trying to get across, that's probably where they live now. I guess there are more people moving back in areas that I know they're not supposed to, but it's still realities that they're there. But so my point would be that, if the rivers are coming down, really, we should be sensible and we know what happens.
Prime Minister Dr. Ralph Gonsalves says that a detailed damage sector analysis puts the cost of damage to agriculture at 172.8 million EC dollars, infrastructure 74.6 million, ash cleanup 38.8 million, and wash $5.3 million. He was at the time responding to a question in Parliament last Thursday from opposition MP Fitzgerald Bramble on the extent of damage to SVG caused by the eruption of the La Soufrière volcano in April.
On the basis of the DDSA, these are the numbers in EC dollar terms, this immediate rapid one. But as we are seeing, it's much more than this. Agriculture 172.8, which didn't take account of forestry fully, and also some of the agriculture. Infrastructure, $74.66 million. Ash cleanup, $38.5 million. Wash, 5.3. Electricity, just, a number which is negligible in the circumstances, maybe $300,000 US. Social, $16.9 million. And coordination, about just over $2 million, giving you $310 million, just over that. The detailed damage assessment, sector assessment.
I just want to go and have a look at the crowd.
PM Gonsalves further explained how the assessment was conducted for the damage sector analysis.
The DDSA is compiled by the government, with CDMA performing, the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, performing a central coordinating role, along with other regional and international entities. And they partnered with the local counterpart assessment teams in undertaking the rapid damage assessment. For example, the damage assessment teams deployed from the Ministry of Agriculture collaborated with experts from AICA, FAO, and CADI in conducting the assessment and compiling the report. The same approach was utilized in each of the sectors covered by the DDSA. Local damage assessment teams, which were established under the NEMO Damage and Needs Assessment Subcommittee, which is a statutory committee under the NEMO Act, joined forces with the expert from regional international organization in doing the damage assessment and sector report.
Meanwhile, Minister of Finance Camilo Gonsalves told Parliament last Thursday that there is no report available for the 2018 poverty assessment. He was responding to a question from leader of the opposition on whether the report has been completed. If so, when it will be released to the public, and if it not has been completed, why?
Indeed, no consultants have been procured as of now to generate the so-called reports that the opposition claims to have released. At best, the opposition claim to have gained access to an incomplete set of data, which they then packaged as a report, devoid of context or analysis, in an attempt to politicize an ongoing statistical process. Indeed, the very language of today's inquiry, where the honorable leader of the opposition first states that the report was made public, then later asks whether the same report is actually complete, begs the question of what it was that they released. If they claim to have made the report public, how can they then ask if the same report has been completed? Setting aside this initial falsehood, the honorable leader of the opposition will no doubt recall that when the issue was last broached in Parliament in June, I informed this honorable House that the institutional analysis and the participatory poverty assessment components of the study were incomplete and that the process was slowed tremendously due to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic.
The finance minister further noted that the poverty assessment is still on hold due to the COVID-19 pandemic. However, 4 of the 5 components of the data collection process have been concluded.
The member is aware has not abated. While the data collection process for 4 of the 5 components have concluded, that is the survey of living conditions and household budget survey, the macro socioeconomic assessment, the participatory poverty assessment, and the institutional analysis. The final analysis of these components and their contingent reports have not yet been completed. It is important to remind this Honourable House about precisely what is involved in the 2018 Enhanced Country Poverty Assessment and to highlight some critical qualitative and methodological differences between this multidimensional study and previous assessments.
He further noted why the poverty assessment is different from previous studies.
The changed assessments of poverty over time and render meaningless any trite, opportunistic attempts to draw conclusions between 2018 incomplete data and earlier studies as if comparing like and like. Prior to the 2018 assessment, data collection and analysis of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, 2 previous poverty studies were performed by Kyrie Consultants, a 30-year-old Trinidadian consultancy with wide experience in poverty analysis throughout the Caribbean. The 2018 assessment involved different formulae, processes, consultants, and methodologies in an effort to more fully capture the various factors that influence poverty in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. New poverty lines, indigence lines, vulnerability lines were established, reflecting not only inflation, but fundamentally different underlying assessments as to what items contribute to the basket of goods measured.
Police here are investigating a fatal vehicular accident that occurred in the Bel Air area this afternoon. According to reports, a young boy was struck by a truck and died on the spot. SVG-TV News will bring you more on this incident in our next newscast. The United Kingdom government has donated 14,000 doses of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine to the government of St. Vincent and the Grenadines to assist in the fight against COVID-19. The vaccines arrived in state on Friday at the Argyle International Airport. Political and Projects Officer of the British High Commission, Sion Samuel, said the UK government is delighted to donate the vaccines to SVG, noting that it marks the end of a relay of donations which started in Antigua and now to SVG as part of efforts to help countries in the Eastern Caribbean tackle COVID-19. Samuel said the UK government is committed to supporting the Eastern Caribbean in its fight to tackle the pandemic as they want everyone to be safe. He said the UK government has pledged to contribute 100 million doses by June 2022 and 8 million will go to COVAX. He noted that by the end of the year, the UK will donate 30 million doses of the 100 million vaccines pledged. Samuel said the donations will help to make the pledge that the G7 leaders have made to vaccinate the world and end the pandemic by 2022. Meanwhile, manager of the medical stores, Steve Millington, expressed gratitude to the UK government for assisting SVG in its fight against COVID-19. Millington said the island is at a point where it is trying to vaccinate as many people as possible, and these donations will be welcomed in the armory in SVG's fight against the COVID-19 pandemic. The local tourism sector has experienced an unprecedented decline never before seen in history. This is according to the Minister of Finance, Camilo Gonzalez, during his address on the second day of the recently held Tourism Stakeholders Conference. The sector, which saw some stakeholders hanging on by a thread, as previously described by President of the Hotel and Tourism Association, Kim Halbish, is said to have experienced a 62% decline in total visitors. Thanking stakeholders for keeping their doors open and persons employed despite the enormous struggles and losses, Minister Gonzalez spoke of the declines seen with cruise line visits, stayover visitors, and yachties, as well as the resulting decline in revenue for the 2019-2020 period.
We fell 60% from 2019 to 2020 in cruise ship passengers, from 255,000 to 101,000. If you count stayover visitors, we fell by 70% from almost 86,000 to 26,000. If you count yacht passengers, which was our most robust sector, we still fell over 50%. From 60-odd thousand to 26,000. And if you count total visitors, we went from 400+ thousand to 150,000. We fell off by 62%. We've never experienced those types of declines year on year in the history of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And if you count revenue, which is where I come in, admittedly data being flawed, but to the extent that it's been counted, the data suggests that the visitor expenditure was about $318 million in 2019. That was about $100 million in 2020.
While SVG's tourism sector struggled immensely, the finance minister noted that the OECS fared much worse during the same time period of 2019-2020. He shared the shocking figures which described the bleak situation in the Eastern Caribbean.
Across the Eastern Caribbean, there were similar declines, greater declines. We went from 5 million tourists in the OECS to about 1.5 million tourists, 1 year to the next. We went from $7 billion to about $2 billion in revenue. And when that shock reverberates throughout the OECS, we all feel it because we're all part of one currency union. And when the currency falls in Antigua, or St. Lucia, or St. Kitts, we feel it in St. Vincent and the Grenadines.
As the COVID-19 pandemic deepened, according to Minister Gonzalez, the tourism sector saw a further 95% collapse in visitors to our shores for the first quarter of 2021 as compared to the same period in 2020. The minister noted that the figures were not expected to get better for the remaining quarters of the year, as there was the eruption of the La Soufrière volcano in the second quarter and Hurricane Elsa in the third.
By the end of March, notwithstanding COVID, St. Vincent and the Grenadines had 144,000 visitors last year, first quarter of last year. First quarter of this year, we went from 144,000 visitors to 7,000 visitors. That's a 95% collapse of the hospitality sector. Instead of earning $91 million, as we did in the first quarter of 2020, we received less than $16 million in the first quarter of this year. 80%.
In noting the situation across the OECS region, the finance minister again shared that the situation was extremely dismal. He said while SVG suffered a 95% decline, its numbers were still better than other islands combined, owing in part to our yachting sector and with no COVID-19 lockdown.
Across the Eastern Caribbean, the decline was even more severe, if you can believe that, than in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Our 7,000 visitors that we got in the first quarter of this year is more than the combined visitors of Dominica, Grenada, and St. Kitts and Nevis. We got 7,000 visitors, but those countries got about 2,000 and a little bit each. Part of it because St. Vincent and the Grenadines never locked down, like some of those other countries did. And part of it because our yachting sector was slightly more buoyant. It's a bad metaphor, but slightly more buoyant than the other categories.
The government of St. Vincent and the Grenadines will not have to pay for any empty seats, unsold seats, nor is there a revenue guarantee clause presented in the contract between Virgin Atlantic Airlines, which is expected to have its first flight to SVG in October. This from Minister of Tourism Carlos James as he responded to a question in Parliament from Opposition Leader Dr. Godwin Friday on the arrangements between the government of St. Vincent and the Grenadines and Virgin Atlantic for the operating service to the country. The first Virgin Atlantic flight to SVG was scheduled for June this year. However, it was pushed back to October 13th due to the pandemic.
The arrangement with Virgin and the government of St. Vincent and the Grenadines will see a twice weekly service. Twice weekly, so on Wednesday and also on Sundays we're expecting to see flights from London. I can tell you since the announcement of Beaches by Sandals, Virgin has been eager to get into our market. And as a result of the potential, and I've listed all of the airlines, Air Canada, CAL, American, and the load factor coming to this destination. We will not be paying for any empty seats or unsold seats on the scheduled Virgin flights from London Heathrow. Neither is there a revenue guarantee clause present in the contract.
Minister James said that at the end of the year, Vincentians can boast that they now have direct access to all major source markets for tourism, which include Europe, London, Toronto, Canada, and Miami. He used the opportunity to outline the schedule for the resumption of the other international airlines to SVG.
American Airlines will return to 2 weekly flights in October, Wednesdays and Saturdays, commencing from October 2021. Air Canada Rouge was pleased with its performance in the 2017-2018 winter season, operating at a 90% load factor on its Pearson to Argyle route. They will return to St. Vincent and the Grenadines sometime roughly in November the 1st, 2021. Caribbean Airlines, they commenced their non-stop, their JFK to St. Vincent service, March of 2018, and they too will also once again return to direct flights from JFK to Argyle on October the 20th, 2021.
Encouraging frontline workers to be vaccinated, Minister James said with the number of flights expected, anything is possible, and they should protect themselves.
Caution Vincentians that with all these flights expected to land here in the last quarter of this year, the COVID-19 pandemic continues to be a concern. Those who are employed on the front line, secondary services such as taxi operators, immigration staff, port workers, we have to be concerned about this. COVID-19 is real, and I want to encourage us to protect ourselves of the likelihood that any of these passengers who are coming can bring the different strains, the variant strains of the COVID-19. But the airport is there, it's working, and thanks to visionary leadership, we can now see an uptick in our investments and exports and visitors coming to our destination from all of our source markets.